Thanks for joining our presentation on archive automation. I'm hoping that this will bring a different perspective to the subject of archiving and the approach that can be taken to implement an archive project. So you might think that we are here just to talk about how you automate your archiving, and I will cover that. However, my primary objective is to discuss why automation is a good idea in an archiving project, and it involves the mindset around the project itself and what's trying to be achieved. I'm also going to back this up with a real-life customer case study which shows the true effect of automating your archive process. Wow, I can't believe it was a year ago that we did that. How often have you said this about something you have done at home, or even at work? Probably more often than you can think of. Time just seems to go much quicker than you can ever imagine, especially when you're busy. And I'll give you a good example. Has it really been 2 years since the last Live in Focus event? Obvious to some, but not really considered much in business because of the way that we view work to be results driven. But the best way to achieve great results is to allow time to be part of your project. If you want a mighty oak tree, then time is the one thing you need. And guess what? It's an easy commodity to acquire, and it's free. So how does this relate to archiving in JD Edwards? Well, for most JD Edwards users, they've been running JDE for 10, 15, or even 20 years plus. We have sites that migrated from Weld and have 30 years of data and never archived, resulting in very large databases and terabytes of data. That data didn't just suddenly appear one day. It took years to build up, and it did so slowly. But when it comes to an archiving project, most companies want it out in days, weeks, or possibly a few months. This can quite often be an unrealistic expectation and also be quite a resource-intensive approach. So quite often an archive project becomes a bit resource-intensive, where a lot of effort is put into the project. It's done once, and then a few years later, when it needs to be done again, the knowledge is lost, or at best it's a bit sketchy. So what's the answer? Archive automation. Hopefully, what you will see is that it is better to trim down the project, make the archiving small, and then automate the process on a regular and ongoing basis. But before we can discuss the archive automation, we need to quickly understand the alternative, what we see as the traditional approach. It's not to say that this isn't a good approach and you shouldn't be doing it this way. This is one method, and we're putting out there an alternative. It is fair to say that this traditional model might be what some people need. So, with the traditional model, archiving is generally approached as a project to be started and ultimately finished. The project isn't complete until the archiving process has been completed itself. Typically, everyone does everything that you want to do in one go. That can be everything from running through all your processes in PY, your different areas to archive, getting your users to sign off on testing of that, moving the whole process to production, and running through your various JD Edwards module processing, archiving processes in production. This takes a period of months, usually, to complete. And once the job is done, you forget about it for a number of years until you're ready to do it again. So what's wrong with this, I hear you say? Well, for a lot of companies, that's a fine approach, but it does have the potential to create some problems. Quite often, this can leave us with a situation where the archiving is not scheduled after the project, so you don't end up with a proactive data management policy going forward. And then in a couple of years' time, the reason for the archiving has not gone away, so you need to do it all again in the future, at which point sometimes knowledge is lost and you're back into doing a project from start to finish. The problem that created all this data has not gone away. It's called business growth, which means that at some stage you'll need to come back and do it again in the future. And that's where the problem starts, as you may have lost resource. Ultimately, it means it never becomes part of your day-to-day operational activities. So moving away from the traditional approach, what do we mean by archive automation? I just want to pause on a thought before we go further. If you have 10 years worth of data, you have spent 3,650 days entering that data. Wow, that's a lot of days. And for a lot of companies on an archiving project, they want it out in 20, 30, or maybe 60 days. There's a big bang expectation that you need to fix this quickly, when really all you need to do is fix it over time. Think about that, 3,650 days. So if you can imagine, you want to archive 10 years worth of data. It's taken 3,650 days to put it all in there. If you can have a daily scheduled job that removes, say, just 10 days data, it will be short, quick, non-invasive to users, as it won't affect system performance. And before you know it, in a year's time, you'll be saying, have we been running those archive jobs for a year already? Wow, that went quick. But before that happens, way before you get to a year, your users will already be saying, what have you done to the system? Things are getting quicker. And as we know in IT, it's always nice to get a good compliment from the users. If you actively and proactively manage the data, you'll be getting these. So how do we automate our archiving? What we're looking for is being able to automate the process with little or no intervention from your system administrators. So firstly, you need a system that is intuitive enough that it can be configured and then set up and left to run with no or minimal intervention from your system administrators. So how do we do this? Well, it's actually much simpler and more straightforward than you might think. There's no magic to it. So what does this mean in implementation? Well, every day, 1 day's data is added. If we set up a job to remove 1 day's data from a year ago, and then another job to remove a day's data from 2 years ago, and so on for 10 years, creating individual jobs to run, and then add them to the JD Edwards scheduler and just let them run. What we will find is that after a year, we have added 1 year's worth of data, but removed 10. Just think about that. It doesn't sound that complicated, and in fact it isn't. It is just about creating a mindset where you are willing to accept that this will be handled in this fashion and then setting it up to run. So just to confirm, the benefits of running a project this way are: your project will be smaller because your whole project lifecycle is geared around testing a much smaller subset of data, proving that this will work, and then implementing it. You don't need to do all the modules. You can start a module at a time but implement the heavy modules first. This will ultimately lead to a quicker implementation, and then you will use time to do what you need. It will free up resource, and ultimately it makes archiving an operational activity, because at the end of the year you don't stop the processes, you just keep them running. So archiving is a productionized process that you do all the time. So if we want to implement archive automation. What do we need? Firstly, the concept isn't really that radical different. There are plenty of tasks that run every day in your IT systems that are automated. To apply this to archiving, you really only need an archiving solution that supports the following things. The ability to configure and rerun archive jobs. A solution that lets you configure your archiving activities so that it renders them down to rerunable jobs with no manual intervention. The ability to be able to dynamically set dates so that they change based on the current date. Then you need to be able to schedule jobs. And after scheduling, you need to be able to monitor those jobs and their progress. Ultimately, this will lead to no manual intervention. So how does Perjet enable this to be done? Well, Perjet is developed within the JD Edwards framework. Firstly, each Perjet archive job is a standard JD Edwards report using batch versions which can store the selection and processing options, and then the configuration becomes the same as any other job on your system. Next, Perjet has a feature called date offsets, which enables dynamic moving dates to be set up on the batch jobs. So the dates we are using are dynamically changing on a day-to-day basis. Being standard JD Edwards reports, all Perjet jobs can be put on the JD Edwards scheduler, and there is the automation aspect of this process. For it to be automated, it needs to be on the scheduler. And then to monitor the whole process, we have intuitive dashboards, leading to no manual intervention required once the jobs are set up. So what are date offsets, I hear you ask? Well, to give an explanation of how they work, these are dynamic dates that are recalculated for each day that you use them. They have a starting position from which they then offset from that point, and you determine the offset from the starting position based on the configuration of the specific dynamic date. And they are flexible and can take account of things like individual company date patterns. So how does Perjet implement this? I have here in front of me an example of a dynamic date. So this is one of the Perjet screens for dynamic date or date offset maintenance. We can see here that when we go in, I'm just gonna draw on the screen. Bear with me a second. So we can see here we can create any date offset that we want. We've created one here called 3 years rolling or 3 rolling. The description of it is rolling 3 years. So I mentioned before that we have a starting point for the date. That's our offset base. This can be configured as end of current year, end of current period. There's options on what the starting point is. For this particular date offset, the starting point is actually today. We then have a function where we can determine what we do with that date. In this instance, we're going to subtract a value from it. We then have units to determine what we're going to subtract, and then we have an offset value. So if I look at this, then on today's date, which is the 28th of September 2021, it's giving a resolved date. If I use this in one of our archive processes, it would give a resolved date of the 28th of September 2018. And if I set this up for used it tomorrow, it would give a resolve date of the 29th of September, and the day after it would give a resolve date of the 30th of September, and in a year's time it would give it for the 28th of September 2019. So this date is always changing depending on the date we're using it. So it's a very simple concept. Date offsets, we set them up, and then we just use them in our processes to configure our starting and ending dates for our archive processes. So how are these actually used within Perjet? Well, I mentioned before that Perjet was developed within the JD Edwards framework, which means that the archiving jobs are simple batch versions where you set up data section and processing options. We have here an example of the general ledger archive routine, which is called RYK 57150. We have batch versions here, and if I looked at this batch version and go into it, we're going to go into the processing options for it. Each archive routine has a similar set of processing options, and one of the processing options on each archive routine, whether it's sales orders, purchase orders, inventory, will always be a selection tab where we put our archive cutoff point. So we're going to archive data up to that point. And we can see we have two methods of configuring the dates or entering the dates. We can put in fixed dates, in this case a from date and a to date as an actual physical date which does not move, or we can enter them as date offset values. So we have a from date offset and a to date offset. The to date in this is 3 years rolling as a date offset. So for this one, we've got a combination of an actual date and a date offset. So this routine, whenever we run it, would always select data from the 1st of the 1st 2000, and the date that it archives up to would always be 3 years prior to the current date that you're running the job. So that's how we implement the date offsets. As I said before, from that point onwards, the way that you automate the process is to put it on the scheduler. You have these jobs running daily, and really you can just forget about them. Obviously, from time to time, you want to manage these processes, and these processes can be managed in two ways within Perjet, and that's through two very intuitive dashboards that we have. The first dashboard is what we call our session dashboard. We see here we have a grid at the top here, which is a list of all the archive jobs that have been run on the system since we started. We can delete old information relating to old jobs if we want, but for every job that we want to keep, this gives a detailed list of the archiving processes, and this acts as our audit information around our archive. So for your jobs on your scheduler, you could come in here and you could check to make sure that they've completed okay. The date and times of the runs on here, the progress is on here, and the amount of data archived on here. And for update runs, we show that the amount of data in the module before the archive and the amount of data in the module after the archive. So at a quick view, it's very easy to see how your processes are running, that they're completing successfully, and that there's no real issue with them. If you actually wanted to look at an individual archive job, you can select it from the grid by just clicking on the radio button, and then the information down here in these tabs then changes to be relevant to the job that you've actually got selected. So we have run status, where we can see the progress up to this point. This job is 100% complete, but if the progress wasn't complete, it would show you how far it had got. We can see information relating to the number of transactions processed, how it's performed. Of this, 5,000 transactions have been archived and 18,000 are in exception for some reason. We have an Analyze tab, which shows us the breakdown of the tables archived in this job. We have an exception analysis, which would give a breakdown of those 18,000 exceptions that we see down here and the functional reasons for those exceptions. We have a log to report any errors, we have email notifications, and we have a performance tab to show us the respective performance of each job itself. And over on the right here, we also have the the job information that would be available from work submitted jobs. So we've got a full history on this screen, and just in amongst it is a graphical representation of the effectiveness of the purge, showing the exceptions and the purge data. In this case, we have some bypass data, which was probably summary transactions in GL. So this dashboard allows us to look at how our jobs are running on an individual job by job basis and get a collective feel for them. So I said there were two dashboards. The second dashboard is the environment dashboard. This dashboard gives an indication of how your environment is looking. It is designed to give a one-page snapshot of your archiving situation, your processes, size, performance, things like that. It's broken down into a few areas. We have, first of all, the dashboard analyzes the difference between the environment you're currently in which case this is a development environment, so it's JDV 920, versus the, in this case, archive data test. For most users, this would be JPD 920 production, comparing it against archive data prod. We can see here that we have a chart which shows us the total size of the archive and the production data. In this case, it's 21% of data is in archive and 79% of the data is in production still. For those two areas, archive and production, we then have two other pie charts. The first one shows us a breakdown of production, and in this case DV, but in your case production. It shows us that a quarter of the data is in general ledger, a quarter of it, just under, is within custom tables, and we can see here that quite a lot of data is within the sales module itself, and then some smaller areas like HR, payroll, and inventory are also showing up on here. If I look at my archive, the same information relating to my archive, I can see that most of the data in my archive is actually in general ledger. There's a lot of inventory data. Oddly enough, there's no sales data in the archive, which implies that the sales archive job probably needs running to remove some data from here, and basically move it into the archive over here. And we can see a grid breakdown here of the different modules that we have or are installed on this system, and we can see the amount of data in each of those modules. So if I look at sales, we can see here there's 18 in this case it's just megabytes of data, and we can see how much is in the archive, and we can see the date of the last archive run. Although this is showing as run, I'm guessing that the archive processor is reversed, and that's why there's no data in the archive. And then we have a column chart here showing for the module selected how the breakdown of those tables are. So F4111 has this many rows in it, and in the archive there are this many rows. So this gives us a snapshot of our environment and the current state of it within the context of our archiving processes. Let me just get rid of the So I said at the start that there would be an example, and here we are with our real life example. The example is for Lazy Boy, and this is a customer case study. So by all means, if you want to see a written copy of this, then go to our website, click-it.com, and look at customer success stories. Now, to understand the case study, it's really good to get an idea of the amount of data that Lazy Boy had and were adding, and this was causing big problems. So the usage of JD Edwards within Lazy Boy, we're looking at this here, that generally the standard distribution manufacturing modules that you would expect a company like La-Z-Boy to be using. Going in size order, reverse order, inventory was the largest, then general ledger, then lots of manufacturing works orders, moving down to sales, some custom tables, purchasing. You can see the list is quite long there. In terms of volumes, La-Z-Boy were adding, creating 40,000 units per week, of which there were 200 plus parts per unit. What this meant was that they were adding 10 million rows to the 4111, 46 gigabytes of data per week, 2 million rows to the F911, 11 gigabytes of data per week, 8 million rows to the 3111, 29 gigabytes of data. These are huge volumes, and 42199, 3 million rows per week, 16 gigs of data alone. This meant that as at the 15th of October 2020, they had 32 terabytes of data in their JD Edwards production environment, of which 21 terabytes had already been moved out to their archive database, and 11 terabytes were currently in production. What challenges did they have? Well, index maintenance was, or re-indexing jobs were running continuously in the background. Many of the jobs just never finished, they just terminated before completion. The F0911, as at the 1st of January 2018, contained 1.484 million rows, well, 1.5 billion rows. That's quite incredible. And they were adding 1.25 million rows per day. Index maintenance on the jobs was forced to terminate before completion during monthly database maintenance. So what they needed was what they considered was a smart approach to this. They had terabytes of data in production. They had the F911 had 1.2 billion rows to archive. The 4111 had 2.5 billion rows to archive. That's not the total size, that's the amount they decided needed to be archived. And a traditional archiving project wasn't cutting the mustard. They had gone down what I described as the traditional archiving project initially, and because of the amount of data that they were trying to get through, they never got it through properly in tests to implement it properly the way that they wanted to in production. So as I said, they needed to consider a smart approach. They needed to archive data with zero impact, and they needed to remove more data than they were adding. At this point, that was the most important thing. They needed to remove more data than they were adding. The zero impact was that they didn't want to affect month, quarter, year-end processes. They didn't want to affect system maintenance or their release schedule. So how do you move a mountain? You move it one stone at a time. So how did La-Z-Boy automate their archiving? Well, they set up a single-threaded queue for archiving major systems. They set up, as I described before, 10 daily short-duration archive jobs. They used time to break down the task, and they spread a huge amount of work, effectively over a huge amount of time. They created 25,000 automated mini archive sessions that were completed. So where did this get them? Well, not at the end of the process, but during the process, they had some Eureka moments. First of all, re-indexings of jobs sped up, and this meant for the first time ever, they were able to index the F911, and they'd never been able to do this before because it normally self-terminated. This led to huge gains in efficiency, and it meant that they weren't always firefighting on system performance and system maintenance. This led to a very excited IT manager coming back with the following quote, that the indexing jobs in the F911 actually finished, and he had never seen this before. Eureka Moment 2. And an export that used to take 12 hours. The export was on the FO911. This came down to 25 minutes. 12 hours down to 25 minutes, a 97% reduction in report runtime. This is just an example of one process that they were doing. This had a slightly different effect where the Director of IT Internal Audit came to IT in a state of panic. He thought there was something wrong because the export normally takes 12 hours, but it completed in 25 minutes. We need this fixed and fixed fast. But there was nothing wrong. It was just quicker. And previously it ran once every quarter because of the length of time it took, and they were now down to running it whenever they needed, allowing more frequent and efficient management within the business. This led to a change in mindset that IT saw from the business. Initially, there was heavy resistance to the concept of archiving. Everyone thinks they need all their data on their production system for when and as they need to access it. But once they'd seen the business benefits, the performance, the response time benefits to their users, they started getting proactive requests to archive other application areas so that they were already also sped up. Because this frees people's time to focus on adding value to the business processes that need them rather than system maintenance. So looking at this chart here, you can see exactly how data was tracked through the general ledger. Initially, we can see here that the 1.5 terabytes of transactions, and it was slowly increasing. Over the course of a year, it slowly came down as the archiving jobs were run on a daily basis. Then after a year, the processes continued to run, and we've seen a much more plateaued position, a managed position, because it's automated and no one needs to think about it. So this has had a positive impact at La-Z-Boy with far-reaching business benefits. They've minimized their risks. They've made archiving was fast and easy to configure, run and monitor. There's minimal system resources required to run it. And they've automated what was previously a manual task, freeing up resource. They're taking data out faster than adding it, and that's the key thing here. That's the thing that's ultimately given them their best impact. That's the main part of the presentation completed. This is a live presentation, so we would normally throw over to questions, but for the recorded version, I'm just going to go to the end of the slide. If you're interested in seeing more about Perjet and the way that Perjet can help your company automate your archive processes, or even a traditional Big Bang approach to archiving, please pop by our website. click-it.com, check out our case studies, and contact us at info@click-it.com. We'll be more than happy to speak to you. Thanks very much for your time, and I hope that you've enjoyed it.